ZoomerLife. Health, wellness, and longevity from the world's brightest minds.
So our next speaker deals with the next big killer, and that is heart disease. And in this case, sometimes I found in my own reading, gender equality is not all that it's cracked up to be. Apparently in 1973, about twice as many men as women died from heart disease. Today, the girls have caught up. In fact, it appears that they may actually have forged ahead, which is to say, the more that women live like men, they die like men. And I think it's the same for stroke, and so cardiovascular disease has become an equal opportunity killer. And to pick up that story, we've invited Paul Dorian here to help us along. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What Moses didn't tell you is that fortunately, women don't act like men, which is a very nice thing. I don't have any slides. I have a 3-year-old grandson who, about age 2, those of you who have kids or grandkids will know that you take a lot of pictures of your first kid and less of your second and even fewer of your third. But then when you have a 2-year-old grandson, you become like a demented paparazzo and follow him around everywhere with your camera and your particularly your BlackBerry, your iPhone. And when he was about 2, he started saying, "No pictures, Grandpa, no pictures." So I have no pictures. Let me tell you a story about how I became a cardiologist, or what drove me to start at least thinking about cardiology as a career, which indirectly relates to some of the cardinal symptoms of heart disease. I was a second-year medical student at McGill, working at the Royal Victoria Hospital, which is, it is exactly as it sounds. It was a very hidebound, traditional, conservative institution. All the people who worked there were sort of hidebound, traditional, conservative. And I begged and pleaded with my mentor surgeon as a second-year medical student who didn't yet know how to wash his hands. I sort of learned a little bit now. And finally, after lots of begging and pleading and cajoling, I was allowed to enter the operating room so I could sort of see firsthand what surgery was like. And in those days, now we do surgery through keyhole surgery. Danny DiPetrillo is sort of an expert at that, but that's not the point of this conversation. But surgery in those days was done through big incisions, and in order for the surgeons to be allowed to kind of work, this was a gallbladder operation, and the patient, the gallbladder is located over here. I'm reversed because I'm not looking in a mirror. Some of you may think I don't know where the gallbladder is, but that's a separate story. So the gallbladder is over here, and in order to view the gallbladder, you have to have a big incision, and the medical student typically was given an instrument called a retractor, which is about the size of a small shovel that you have to put inside the incision and kind of make sure the surgeon could see. And then the surgeon said, because he was afraid I would move and I would do something, I would sneeze or do something sort of not appropriate for the operating room, he said, "Don't move a muscle." So I stood there holding the shovel for about 2-3 hours. It was hot, I was sweaty, I was starting to feel a little faint, and I was petrified of moving so not to annoy the surgeons. And in those days, probably still today, you do not annoy surgeons. Danny's maybe an exception, but if you annoy a surgeon as a student, you're in trouble forever. So I was absolutely standing stock still for about 2 or 3 hours, and then eventually I got really dizzy, and I began to feel faint, and eventually I passed out. And the next thing I know, I'm lying on the ground looking up at all these fringes of the green gowns of all the nurses and the doctors. Nobody paid the slightest bit of attention to me. I could have been dead. They didn't care. I was the annoying little medical student. But I was too weak to stand up. One of the things that happens when you faint from a kind of a faint called a vasovagal syncope, we may have a chance to talk about fainting in a minute, because fainting can be one of the cardinal symptoms of severe heart disease. You can faint from very rapid heart rhythms, very slow heart rhythms. My particular special interest is what's called heart rhythm disturbances. I'm like an electrician of the heart. That's called cardiac electrophysiology. So I deal a lot now in my professional life with fainters. Young people who faint, generally, it's not a problem, it's not severe. You don't need special tests. Another thing we may come back to is a lot of young people who faint are given unnecessary, expensive, useless tests, MRIs, brain scans, invasive investigations, all unnecessary because they're going to do very well. An older individual who faints, we have to pay much more attention to. Maybe we'll come back to that. Anyway, this was not a serious thing, but it was very embarrassing, and I was too weak to stand up. So nobody paid any attention to me, and I crawled over to the edge of the operating room, and I lay against the wall, but I was too weak to stand up and open the door, so I lay there. Nobody paid attention to me. So then when the door opened, I kind of crawled out on my hands and knees and lay on the floor in the hallway. People were stepping over me. It was like I was just a log on the ground. And eventually, I was well enough to stand up and slink out of the operating room, never to return. That's how I became a cardiologist, although now I do invasive procedures where you put lines and tubes and lasers and everything inside the heart, and I've sort of gotten used to it, and I don't faint anymore. But that's how I became a cardiologist. One of the things that we all need to think about when we talk about heart disease is that in a way it's analogous to cancer. There's no one kind of heart disease. Heart disease is or what we call cardiovascular disease, because generally cardiologists or people interested in the heart are also doctors or clinicians or researchers or nurses or nurse practitioners interested in diseases of the great blood vessels, because these things tend to go together. So what causes heart disease most often in our society is hardening of the arteries, but arteries can feed blood to the heart, and that can cause a heart attack, but arteries can take blood to the brain, and if those arteries become clogged or have a clot in them, that can cause a stroke. If arteries to the legs get blocked up, then you can get pain in the legs, and you can get ulcers and problems with your circulation. So all of these things are sort of lumped together in cardiovascular disease. Now, one of the common fallacies or common misconceptions about heart disease is that it's all related to hardening of the arteries, and it's all related to cholesterol, and it's all related to exercise. It turns out, I'm afraid, it's much more complicated than that. That's sort of good news and bad news in a way, is that much of heart disease, fortunately, usually treatable, and we can fix it and do things about it. Much of heart disease doesn't involve the plumbing. The plumbing is the blood vessels, what we call vascular disease. You can have diseases of the heart's electrical system, which is what I deal with on a day-to-day basis. You can be born with heart disease. You can have holes in your heart. You can have valve problems. So that the concept of heart disease is much broader than what is generally imagined. And the important thing is that when you read about, everybody needs to watch their salt and exercise and not smoke, all of that is absolutely true. But the good news in a way is that not all heart disease is necessarily related to those kinds of risk factors. So we'll come back to the kinds of heart disease that is not related to the plumbing, but let's talk about plumbing in a minute, because probably certainly in the Western world, and now, unfortunately, in the developing world, where the developing world's habits are changing for reasons that I'll explain to you in a minute, and they're catching up to us, just like women have caught up to men with respect to the risks of developing plumbing disorders, at least in part because women live longer than men, and these diseases are diseases of aging. And also, very unfortunately, starting about 20 or 30 years ago, women started to smoke much more than men, or smoke as much as men, and the rates of smoking increased in women quite sharply. Fortunately, they're stabilizing or coming down a little bit now, and 20, 30 years later, smoking catches up with you with respect to the risk of plumbing problems. So let's just talk about plumbing, most important kind of issues. All of us in this room, all of us in Canada, are prisoners of our evolutionary heritage, if you like. I don't like to use the word designed, because it brings all kinds of religious connotations, but we're designed by evolution to not want to run and work too hard, because that's energy consuming and fatiguing. We're designed by evolution, when we see food, we want to eat it, particularly fatty food or food rich in nutrients, rich in calories, high in fat, high in sodium. That's a design feature. We're arguably not nearly as well designed as the iPhone. Don't get me started on the iPhone. But, oh, by the way, the other day, I don't have an iPhone, but I had a colleague of mine had an iPhone. He said, what a clever thing. You can just talk into this thing, and it's got this personal assistant named Siri, and Siri will do whatever you ask Siri to do. And if he showed me, he says, I'll take this, and says, Siri, please make an appointment with Paul next Thursday afternoon at 2 p.m. in his office. And Siri says, of course I will. So on a lark, I took the iPhone from him, and I said, Siri, I love you. And Siri says to me, but I hardly know you. So so that's all I have to say about the iPhone. We are prisoners of this 100,000-year history we have, where we exercise when we have to chase mastodons and gazelles or whatever on the steppes of the veld. We go for firewood, we look for water, we don't have food very often available to us. So it's very difficult for us as ordinary human beings to be able to overcome these limitations, if you like, or the opportunity in the Western world to have access to as many calories as we want, even if we, unfortunately, people without much means and perhaps much education and living in certain parts of the world, particularly, let's say, northern Canada, where fresh foods are not as available, they're expensive. We have all the decks, if you like, are stacked against us in Western society, and sadly now, even in developing societies, where calories are relatively cheap, calories are abundant, calories tend to be poor quality calories. We no longer are obligated to walk for firewood, for water, for our daily needs. We have conveyances, cars largely, that takes us to places we want to go. We don't have to travel long distances. We have highly addictive substances. Tobacco is an extremely addictive substance. It's not a moral issue. When you start smoking, you'll keep smoking. You take a drag on a cigarette, there's a virtually instantaneous hit in the particular parts of your brain that are sensitive to the chemicals from cigarette smoke. From the lungs to the brain takes about 2 seconds. It's as effective as intravenous heroin. I'm not a heroin user, so I can't tell you how effective that is, and I've never smoked. I'm speaking from secondhand knowledge, fortunately. It's like secondhand smoke. But the point is that these things are designed, if you like, or have historically evolved in a way to appeal to the worst part of our natures. And there's not much we can do about it directly. Indirectly, what we can do is we can think about it, because we are fortunate as evolved, most of us, or my children tell me I'm not too evolved, but most of us as evolved human beings have the opportunity to take our thinking brains and basically suppress our natural instincts towards wanting to relax, wanting to take advantage of chemicals in the environment like cigarettes, if we're so inclined, wanting to eat more calories, more fat, more salt, etc. As it turns out, approximately 80% of heart disease worldwide, this does not apply to each individual, but about 80% of heart disease worldwide can be attributed to risks that are remediable. And by remediable, we mean this is work done largely by a very fantastic cardiologist named Salim Yusuf, who's based in Hamilton, who now is of Indian origin. And in India, as some of you may know, in South Asia, particularly India and Pakistan, there's a epidemic, a tsunami of heart disease, as individuals who previously were poor, thin, because they had no calories, they had no food to eat, they had to walk for every aspect of their daily lives. And unfortunately, also these individuals in rural India would die from infectious diseases, tuberculosis, etc., but now they're living a little longer. And now these individuals, as they move into the cities, and he's studied large cities like Bangalore and Delhi and so on, individuals are starting now to develop and die from heart disease at a young age. And this is also true for people of South Asian origin living in Canada who are particularly prone to heart disease, and that's because now calories are becoming available and physical exercise is no longer absolutely necessary. And the work done in those environments probably also applies to Canada, is that about 80-85% of heart disease can be attributed to one of 5 or 6 things. On the negative side, can be attributed to smoking, excess calories, overweight, which then brings on diabetes as a consequence. I mentioned lack of physical exercise, high blood pressure, and your genetics. Now that's something you can't do anything about. On the flip side of what can you do to reduce your risk of heart disease, and these things are, when you take an average person with heart disease, they tend to have much more likely to have the undesirable things like smoking, lack of exercise, excess weight, excess calories, excess fat, excess salt, and they're likely not to have the beneficial things, which are physical exercise, which includes both things like running and jogging and cycling and swimming, which are what we call isotonic exercises, where you move your body through space. But we're also now beginning to discover it also includes things like isometric exercise, which is lifting things, whether it's lifting weights. It doesn't mean you have to be Arnold Schwarzenegger in order to keep you physically strong, but you have to do anything that requires you to do physical resistance kind of exercises. It may be light weights, it may be doing push-ups, whatever is appropriate for your age and your health and other things. So it includes exercise, eating green leafy vegetables or vegetables of any kind, and fruit intake. So higher vegetable intake, higher fruit intake is related to less risk of plumbing problems, and conversely, low intake is related to more risk. So there's things that all of us in this room can do. We can't get rid of our genes, but there's things we can do. And you hear this all the time, and it becomes, I know, a little bit of a boring mantra to read about this all the time, but there's things that each of us can do to limit our own personal individual risk. Now, one of the questions I often get from patients who've had a heart attack, for example, is, I did all the right things, I didn't smoke, I didn't drink too much, I exercised, and I still developed heart disease. So not all heart disease can necessarily be prevented by these activities or changes in behavior. Unfortunately, they need to start very young, probably in your teens if they're going to have some resonance, and they're imperfect, but they absolutely do decrease your risk. One of the things we're beginning to discover with respect to cholesterol is that all of us, without any exception in this room, have high cholesterol. All of us. So what we think of as normal cholesterol, which is why probably some of you in this room, either yourselves or friends or family, have been on a cholesterol-lowering medication. And that's because even if your cholesterol is in quotation marks normal, it's twice as high as it would have been 50,000 years ago when we were living on berries and fruits and eating meat only occasionally and eating many fewer calories. So the normal cholesterol is probably less than half. It's probably about a quarter of what the average cholesterol is. And that's one of the reasons why all of us are at some risk, even though we do all the right things, if you like. But doing all the right things would mean living a diet and living a lifestyle that's probably not possible or acceptable to most individuals living in the developed world. So that's kind of where we are with respect to plumbing diseases. I don't have time to talk to you in some detail about other kinds of things. There are electrical diseases of the heart. There's a very common disorder that is now seen in many, many individuals in their 60s or 70s and 80s called atrial fibrillation. That's an electrical disturbance of the heart. If you want to look that up, that's something that I deal with personally every day, just to remind ourselves that there's many other kinds of heart disease. Let me just say one thing, if I may, for those of you yourselves or friends or family or acquaintances who interact with the medical system of cardiologists. Cardiologists are bad listeners, much worse listeners than cancer doctors. They have an average of about 10 to 15 minutes with a patient. And what I think we would benefit from in Canadian society, Canadians are very polite. By the way, how do you get 100 Canadians out of the swimming pool? Please, would you get out of the swimming pool? So I say that when I'm giving lectures in New York, and they look at me like, this guy's nuts. But Canadians are very polite, and Canadian patients are very polite. And if there's one thing I can leave you with in the last 30 seconds is the way to improve cardiologic care. We have tons of tools. We have tons of fancy machinery, robotics, advanced technologies we don't have time to talk about. But in order for those to be used appropriately, it requires a conversation, often not held between patients and physicians, and requires patients to be assertive, ask questions, be obstreperous if you have to, don't take no for an answer, and if you don't think you understand, keep bugging the doctor until you get it right. Thank you very much.
Great speaker. Thank you. Yeah, let's have a picture. That's great.
By the way, I have to say that when Moses threw those, it looked like the tennis players who throw the tennis balls into the audience. He's got a fantastic arm. He's going to live to be 110. Thank you.
That's great.